Hello, I'm Wendy. Today I'm painting watercolour Christmas cards with experimental backgrounds, and the subject is rose hips. I've painted them in some detail before in an autumn painting video, and I'll put the link to that below. Today though, we're going to paint them and make them quite Christmassy with flecks of snow and a nice experimental soft background. I'm showing you here a selection of cards I made from little experimental paintings. You can use all the techniques, of course, that I'm going to show you to put together your own compositions and your own colour schemes. These are three of the aperture cards that I quite like to use. They're quite small. The apertures of the two larger cards here are about 3 inches by 3 inches, and the smaller card I think is about 2 inches by 2 inches, something like that. I made a start by doing a very simple drawing of 3 rose hips. I drew it onto cartridge paper and ink, and then I traced it using my light box onto watercolour paper. It's quite good to do this because it means you can do several pictures quite quickly without having to redraw every time. And using the techniques that I'm using, there's a lot of drying time that you have to sort of twiddle your thumbs, so it's good to be working on more than one at once, I think. There's a link in the description box below if you'd like to download this image. I'm just loosening up the paints a bit here with a spray before I start. As you can see, I masked out the drawing that I did with some masking fluid. I have a video I did previously. I'll put you a link below if you would like to find out more about how to apply the masking fluid. The washes that I'm using here for the background, they comprise of a sort of mauve wash of ultramarine with light red, and I make 1 or 2 different colours, so to ring the changes so that you've got different colours going on in the background. Some areas a bit bluey, some a bit red, and you'll see that also I'm going to put in a little bit of yellow in there as well. I think those colours look quite nice together. You can see that I'm working very wet here, dropping the paint in and letting the colours merge together. I like to let the colours dry naturally and not use a hairdryer, but towards the end then I will sometimes. But as a quick tip for you, what I find is that the paint on top of the masking fluid can sort of make little bubbles and puddles, and it takes a longer time to dry, so a good idea is just to mop that up with a tissue. It also prevents smudging as well when you're removing the masking fluid with your finger or a rubber. I'm just doing another demonstration here using stronger paint. I've speeded this up so that it doesn't get too boring, but it'll just give you an idea of some of the different tones and colours that you can put in there and get some more strength of colour behind the rose hips. Towards the end of this little demonstration of the wash, I'm going to put some salt in as well to get some more textural effects in the background. I won't be working on this one any further than this, but I will show you the finished result towards the end of this video. As I said earlier, it's a good idea to have several of these little drawings to work on at once and to experiment. Don't get too hung up on working just on one picture. I find sometimes the quicker you work as well, you can get some better results rather than labouring something. Here you can see the effects of the salt working almost immediately, but you do have to leave it to dry and not put the hairdryer on it. I removed the masking fluid when everything was dry, and then I set out a combination of, a selection of different reds that I would dip into as I was painting. I used mainly cadmium red deep with some permanent rose, and I think I've got a little pyrrole red out there, which is quite an exotic colour for me. I mixed up some cadmium orange for starters to form the sort of base layer, and then I worked wet into wet with the reds. It was sort of intuitive way of painting, just to see how the colours merged, and I just adjusted as I went along and gradually added some deeper reds as the paint was drying. As you can see, I worked each rose hip in the same way, and I went backwards and forwards between them as the paint was drying to add some darker tones, particularly at the tips of the rose hips and maybe a little bit nearer the stem. It's important to keep each of the rose hips wet while you're doing this. So if you find that you do work quite slowly, then you can work on one rose hip at a time. Mix up enough colour for all of them, so you're not having to remix a lot, and work one of them at a time, and don't panic, and just keep adding the darker paint to it as it's drying. Make sure that you leave some of the orange showing through. I found it was quite easy to actually put too much red on so that you lost the orange, but you need to keep those orange highlights to give the rose hips some form when you finish painting them. For the darkest darks at the very tips of the rose hips, that's where I put it mainly, I think, I added some ultramarine to the mix. And don't be frightened of going quite dark here, because it's a nice contrast. These little dark places on the rose hip, they contrast quite nicely with the lighter areas, and again they add to the form of the rose hip itself. The next stage is painting the stem and the little leaves. Put out a mixture of greens here. I used Prussian blue as the base for the greens, and to make the very dark green I added some burnt sienna to the mix. To make the lighter greens I added the raw sienna to the Prussian blue. I have a video out that I made some time ago on mixing greens using Prussian blue as the base blue, and I'll put you a link to that in the description box below. I think Prussian blue makes a really nice blue to do greens in nature. I also added a little bit of just burnt sienna in odd places here on the stem. Again, I was just painting a little bit intuitively, just dotting different colours about. Importantly, some different tones, so you've got some light and dark areas in there that will suggest the form in the leaves in the finished picture, hopefully. Remember, you're going to be putting some snow on these, covering places up, so you've not got to be too particular with it. These little tendrils on the end of the rose hips are really fun to paint. A bit easy to overdo, don't put too many on there. And what I found was painting them, if you put the brush on its side near to the tip of the rose hip and flattened it against the paper and then lifted it gently, then you'd get this sort of nice shape that you see on the rose hips. snow itself that's sitting on the stem and the leaves and the rose hips, you could use white gouache, you could use acrylic. I'm quite liking this pen white. It's very opaque and you usually only need to put one layer of it on, and it goes on very nicely. It does have a little tendency to blob if you've got too much on your brush, so you'll see when I'm using it that I do take a little bit off before I start doing the painting, particularly in the very small areas. Use a very small brush and just dot around the areas of the rose hips, and stand back from time to time just to see how it's looking. It was decision time on which aperture card to use. I wasn't too keen on the white on there. I thought the red looked a lot better. This was the dark wash that I demonstrated earlier, and I worked the picture up in a very similar way. So again, which do we like best? Do we like the white on it or the red on it for the aperture? It can be very subjective, can't it? Well, there we are. I hope this video inspired you to experiment and make lots of Christmas cards for your friends and your relatives. If it did, you can give me a thumbs up, and you can subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss any upcoming videos. Bye for now.